next voice we hear will be of someone who's very little known in American history, but should be better known. This is the voice of the great Mr. Esau Jenkins in December 1966, speaking in Johns Island, South Carolina.
This is Esau Jenkins talking, who have known these people for years, have known the tribulation, have known the ups and downs. Every December on the 24th, they have what we call a Christmas Watch Night meeting here in the Moving Star Hall. They know the tune, they're ready to shout. They're giving praise to the great Supreme Being who have stood by them in the past days from slavery up to this present. Right here tonight, they will be singing from 12 o'clock until Christmas morning. Just to hear these songs remind us of our hardship. Those songs are the ones that made them happy, made them go through those hard days, the days when they didn't have a place to live of their own, didn't have a piece of land of their own, and living on a plantation. These people are hard-pressed people, and they're optimistic enough to believe that the better days are coming. When they get into these religious shout, they feel so happy that that's all they can do but shout. The emotion will go into their hands and to the feet and start clapping. And you can't keep them sitting. And not when they start clapping, brother. They feel so happy till they got to shout. People 60 years and 70 years old will clap and shout and jump all over the floor without falling down.
Now, Mr. Jenkins, as I said before, was a person in American history who's been greatly neglected for a number of reasons. He was born in 1910 on Johns Island, South Carolina, which is a rural hamlet, well, which was, should I say, a rural hamlet outside of the city of Charleston, which was once considered a fairly backward, rural type community, country community, up until very recent years. And he never managed to get past the 4th grade. He was one of a large family and such, and so he basically had to work out in the fields to support his family, as was the case with a lot of people in those days. But in spite of the fact that he had very little formal education, he went on to do heroic things, and that started early. On July the 28th, 1968, the Charleston News and Courier did an interview with Mr. Jenkins where it talked about his life and the roots of his activism. And he said the roots of his activism came on from 2 occasions. He said that his father, Peter Jenkins, was at a store one day and that the white man at the counter basically cheated his father. And so his father said, "Wait a minute, that's not right." And Esau counted the money correctly. And the man looked at Esau Jenkins' father, and Esau's father, Peter, told him, "Son, the white folks don't like you doing stuff like that." And he was a small child when his father said this. And a short time after this, he was visiting a friend where a white farmer came to the house and asked about the children. And the lady told the man where the children were, so he said, okay. So the man went to the school and pulled the children out so they could go work in the fields for him. And he was horrified by all of this. And he was determined one day to change his conditions. And that's important because a lot of times when people are born and raised in poverty and oppression, that's all they know. And they don't see anything unusual about it. But there's some people who are visionaries. See, most people, they look at the world as it is and accept it that way. Others are visionaries who look at the world as it should be and try to make it better. That's why you have so many followers and so few leaders. Think about that. Anyway, Mr. Jenkins went on to work with the market on Market Street in downtown Charleston, selling his wares, and he noticed a lot of Greek salesmen there. So he took the time to actually learn how to speak the Greek language, so much so that they often joked that whenever he came around, the Greek merchants in Charleston would say, "Here comes the colored Greek." But he also took that to an even higher level. You see, in those days, in order for black people to vote, they had to pass these literacy tests. And of course, they were often rigged so that they wouldn't pass to begin with. But Mr. Jenkins found out of the rules that they needed to learn in order to register to vote, and he taught, even with his fourth grade education, he taught the people around him to learn how to read so that they can register to vote, or even memorize the test questions so they could register to vote. And soon he was taking them in a bus that he had to the city of Charleston to register to vote, and sometimes taking children to the schools because there was no high school for black children on Johns Island well until the 1950s. So he had this organization called the Progressive Club, where he taught adults voting skills, consumer skills, and so forth, and he practiced what he preached. He had motels up around Atlantic Beach, South Carolina, which was a resort for African Americans outside of Myrtle Beach, as well as the J&P Motel in downtown Charleston and the C&O Credit Union, which still exists long after his death on Spring Street in downtown Charleston. But along with these other things, he also fought for civil rights. He ran for the school board on Johns Island in 1956, and of course he lost, but that encouraged a whole lot of people. And he became a close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Charleston. In fact, here is a photo with Dr. King speaking in Charleston in 1967, if you can see this here. It's from my book, True Stories of Black South Carolina. Mr. Jenkins is right by my finger, standing there while Dr. King is giving his speech. Now, his granddaughter, Jackie Grimble Jefferson, and I are very good friends, and Jackie was there when Dr. King spoke in the presence of her grandfather. And she said that she always thought of Dr. King as quote-unquote my friend, because her grandfather, in spite of the fact that he didn't have a whole lot of education, he didn't see people in terms of class, and he always referred to Dr. King as my friend. So she just assumed that Dr. King, when she was a child, was a close friend of her grandfather. Well, along with this, he managed to send each of his children to school, and many of them became educated and business people and such. In fact, his son James, in fact, taught at Lang High School with my father in the 1960s. And along with this, he also became a member of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. But there are also interesting stories of courage involving Mr. Jenkins. Back in 1999, I interviewed Mr. Herbert Fielding, who was a local mortician, as well as a former senator. And he told me this very interesting story about Mr. Jenkins' courage. He said Esau and I were in this little Volkswagen, and one day we were in Tennessee and tried to get gas. And so as we were pumping gas, Mr. Jenkins asked the proprietor, where was the bathroom? And the bathroom proprietor said, well, we don't have bathrooms for colored people. So Mr. Jenkins put the gas nozzle back into the tank and said, well, I'm not paying for any of this colored gas then. And he drove off without paying for the man. And Mr. Fielding said, well, I'll be damned. Esau's going to get us killed right here in Tennessee. But they escaped unscathed. Bill Saunders, who was the head of Cobra in Charleston and the former owner of the city's radio station WPAL, told another interesting story about Mr. Jenkins. He said that on one occasion on Johns Island there was an accident, and a black guy was killed on the side of the road. So all these black people gathered to watch it, and then the policeman came by and wouldn't let anyone near the person who was killed. But Esau drove up in his Volkswagen bus, walked through the crowd, past the policeman, pulled up the sheet and said, this is Big Jim, and pulled the sheet back down, walked past the crowd, past the policeman, and others were scared to death to do something like that, but not Mr. Jenkins. He also gave some pretty interesting speeches. He once spoke about the whole issue of the Black Panther movement, who was considered a very distractive force by many in the late 1960s. And I mean, most of you heard of the Black Panther movement. And he had to say this in that same interview I was telling you about in 1968 in regard to the Black Panther movement. Many of the young people considered them heroic, and many of the older folks were wary of their willingness to use guns and such within their program. But Esau Jenkins had this to say. If the white folks had listened to reason, there wouldn't be a Stokely Carmichael or H. Rap Brown, referring to the leaders of that movement. I believe in black power in the extent that the Negro should lift himself up morally, spiritually, politically, and economically. But when it comes to hating white folks and hating the church and cursing white people, I don't buy into that. It takes a pretty large person to love, but any small person could hate. That's how he felt about it. But no one could say that he was a soft and weak man, because the simple fact that he often risked his life, as described earlier, on his principles. And he often said some really interesting things to young people. He was one of the main forces behind the establishment of Hot Gap High School, which was the black high school in Johns Island, which is today a middle school. And in 1972, he had a couple of interesting things to say to them. Many people, of course, when someone grew up in poverty and lacked education and all that, tend to look down on them. But listen to these words. He said that stay in school, get all the education you can so you can cope with this sophisticated moonflight age. But remember, never feel that you are better or more important than your parents or those who did not have an education, because sometimes they have what you do not have and know what you do not know. In other words, we can all learn from someone. Shortly after all of this, he was in an automobile accident up around Knoxville, Tennessee, and he was brought home and he died here on October the 30th, 1972, at the age of 62. Thousands of people showed up for his funeral, and it was administered by the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, who was Martin Luther King's assistant. And today you can also find t-shirts of Mr. Jenkins with his slogan, as well as his Volkswagen bus. A door of it has been donated to the Smithsonian Institution, and both the shirt and the bus door have some of his most famous words, which is love is progress, hate is expensive. And I want to close on this note. People often speak of Dr. King and Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and all these others. But if you talk to those who were still alive in those days, or look through the old newspapers and old magazines of that era, you will find that almost every African American community of size in those days had at least one individual like the great Esau Jenkins, whose story, as I said before, I chronicled in this book, True Stories of Black South Carolina. So look and learn about these individuals that history forgot. You may find some inspiration to do the same type of heroic deeds. This is Damon Fordham talking about the great Esau Jenkins.